This video has been classified as M. It is recommended for people aged 15 years and over.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Why write about sex? Frank?
Oh dear. Well, when you're a university lecturer, it gives you a great excuse to use four-letter words when you're quoting from the original sources, which is fantastic. Students love it. They think, oh, isn't that rude? But more seriously, I think it's because it's a matter of life and death. And I think that, even today, people commit suicide. People have gone to the gallows historically because of their sexual preferences or their sexual acts. And I think that, it's one of the most fundamentally important things in history, basically.
And it's why we're here.
And it is why we're
how
here
we're
too.
here.
Absolutely.
I guess.
Yeah, it is why we're here and how we're here.
And people are still going to the gallows. That's the terrifying thing. No doubt that will come up tonight. Cheryl?
There's no way around it. I mean, it is where we all began. And really, I write about sex not just in my advice column, but in my novel, in my memoir. It's a thread that runs through all of my work because it's a thread that runs through human experience. And not just a thread, it's a significant part of who we are, I think. Sexual desire is, we came from that, all of us, and many of us grapple with it in so many ways throughout our lives. And so it's inevitable to write about it.
Well, you're incredibly courageous because you're very biographical about how you write about sex, explicitly so.
Right.
At what point, I'll just sneak this one in, at what point did you first allow yourself to do that? At what point did you go, I'm going to go there and I'm going to publish it?
Well, I think that part of the writer's job is to be honest about what it means to be human. And so there would be no way to say, well, I'm going to tell the truth about everything. And I mean truth in the largest sense of really illuminating that, who are we really as people? And there's no way to say, I'll write honestly about all of these other aspects of life, but not about sex. And so I just decided that, of course, I needed to do that, and it does make me feel afraid and uncomfortable and embarrassed sometimes. But really, the response has always been positive, because when you tell the truth about your sex life, we're not that original. Most of us actually have sex lives that resemble the sex lives of a lot of other people, and so it feels risky. And yet, what the chorus is yes, me too. Thank you. That's how I feel. That was my experience. And so it's actually very validating. I'm not alone in some of the difficulties I've had with sex, some of the joys, some of the fun.
Yes. Ben, I wonder if you're going to say, well, how could you not write about sex?
It's funny you bring up this question because recently I was giving a talk to high school boys, and just to introduce myself, I had to talk about the things that I've written about, whether in feature articles, in my books. And my last book was about sex and sexuality throughout Asia, and I've written I've written feature articles about nudist beaches, and I've written stories about sex education in certain states. And one of the students put up their hand and said, why do you write about sex so much? And I'm like, dude, you're a high school teenage boy. I think you know better than I do why I write about this stuff. But the honest answer to this question is to probably go back into my childhood, really. If you read my first book, you'll find out that I grew up in a very open household, and my mother would always regale us with stories about how each of us were born in a graphic way, to the point where sometimes she would talk about the ways in which each of us was conceived. And and The Joy of Sex was always a book that was around. Like, we read it very, very young. It was never an off-limits taboo thing.
Right next to the Golden Book.
Yeah,
collection.
Pretty much. I think there could be a crossover collaboration between the two genres. And,
sounds like my household.
Yeah, and even when Sophie Lee's Sex was on, this incredibly controversial program in its time, which spoke about sex and sexuality quite frankly, and was controversial and discussed, I think, in Parliament as well. It was family time for us. We would gather around and watch Sophie Lee's Sex and Sex Life, and it was a great point of discussion. And I think as a result, because we're so open and so educated about it, we like talking about it. We think that it's an interesting, funny, serious thing to talk about as well. And haven't stopped writing about it since in some ways.
Funny, yes, but also there's a lot of tragedy in Gaysia,
Absolutely.
So and we'll come to this, but that whole marketplace for sex, which many would say is a great indicator of sexual freedom, that we now can buy and sell sex anywhere, anytime. In fact, there's some profoundly tragic stories that you unearthed in your travels across Asia around that kind of marketplace of sexuality.
And when you talk about sex and you talk about the commodification of it, it brings up this whole other dimension to sex and sexuality and the market of it and how you sell yourself and all that stuff. And I think for my book, in some ways, I started off writing stories about sex and sexuality because in some ways you can make cheap jokes about it. It's funny. You're going to draw people in. And then by the end of the book, it actually gets, like you say, quite tragic, quite serious. But I want you to be able to read about those topics by inviting you into a world that seems funny and light and risque at first, but there is a whole other dimension to what we're talking about too.
Unlike Cheryl, though, I thought you're a bit more hesitant about putting your own self in some of those sexual encounters that you documented. You were almost there.
You shouldn't read your own reviews. You always say, I don't read my own reviews, but I have read at least 2 reviews that said, for a book that's all about sex and sexuality, it almost seems like a chaste book. And I'm like, do you really want to read about me having sex? Really, this example of virile manhood, I guess. But do you want to? I don't want to put that in your brain. That's unfortunate.
It's a fine line, isn't it? It's a fine line.
Later.
Farah, your book was the work of, I think, over a decade. Is that right? An incredible compendium of stories of sort of sexual oppression and sexual liberation throughout the 15th, medieval times onwards. Why did you want to take it on?
It wasn't autobiographical, but well, I grew up in Amsterdam in the 1970s, so and then moved to England in the 1980s at the height of Mrs. Thatcher's
a very sexy time.
Regime. So I did have some experience of contrast there. But as a historian, there are 2 things that fascinate me and led me to write my book, which is, on the one hand, how different modern Western sexual freedom is from what has existed even in the West for most of history. For most of Western history, people didn't have sexual freedom. They were punished for having sex outside marriage. So how did we come to have the attitudes we now do? Why do we now take for granted that people have the right to do what they like with their own bodies? That's the first thing. And the other thing is, in our culture today, we are so messed up, really, in so many ways, and so contradictory in how we approach sexuality and sexuality of men and women. And I really wanted to explain where this kind of mess of different ideas that never can be sorted into a consensus comes from.
What do you mean by messed up? How do you see that we are messed up about sex? I mean, I count the number of ways, I suppose, but give some dimensions to that.
Well, I suppose one way of doing it would be everyone agrees that consenting adults should have the right to do what they like with their own bodies. That's a kind of touchstone of modern attitudes. But then when you start to investigate what that means in practice, it's very, very slippery because we could never, across different cultures and within one culture, no one ever entirely agrees on what an adult is or what consent is or whether there are actions that are entirely private because many actions affect other people as well. So, the limits of what is permissible are constantly changing and under discussion. That's just one example. And then, the public and the private, we all agree, sex is private, but on the other hand, where does the dividing line lie when a politician has an affair or, when a celebrity's love life is partly kind of broadcast by that celebrity and partly exhumed by journalists, that kind of thing. Those tensions and contradictions.
Frank, it's interesting reading your book, The Sex Lives of Australia, a history. We were very messed up about sex in the early colonial era of Australia, weren't we? Let's start with the marketplace of colonial Australia, because it was a majority of men, minority of women, What did that mean for sexual encounters?
Well, it meant very limited opportunities for what we now call heterosexual encounters for men. It meant that, the frontier was a place of sexual adventure for convict men, for early settlers, with respect to Aboriginal women. And so, that's a really important theme, I think, in early Australian history. It would have been an important theme if we'd had a perfect sexual balance or sex ratio, I imagine. But I think that, the fact that this was very much a man's world. One historian has called it a crew culture. So hard drinking, hard living, and whoring, the term they would have used. And I think that gives an important complexion to early colonial Australia. It's surely part of the origins of this cult of mateship that we have, isn't it? And I guess it's probably only in the last sort of 30, 40 years that we've been able to confront the fact that male mateship has this sexual edge, this homoerotic edge.
Yeah,
and,
there's a whole story around the Cali boys and the bushrangers, hey?
Oh, well, not really.
We were very excited about that behind the stage.
There was a historian, historian of Australian English, who claimed that the Cali gang were a gang of homosexuals, but his evidence for this was actually pretty slim, I think. Yeah. But, I think what he was grappling with was this notion of male mateship. And, I think that's been really important. There was a great historian, Russell Ward, of the 1950s, who, said that, mateship was sublimated homosexuality. And, if you think of some of the films over the years, think of Gallipoli and that relationship between Frank and Archie. Or one of my favourites, actually, is They're a Weird Mob, which is set in this city, of course, in the mid-1960s. And, the relationship in that between the character Dennis, played by John Malyon, and Nino, this Italian immigrant, and Michael Powell, that wonderful filmmaker. The erotic aspect of that is so evident, I think, and I think that early
it's there, but it's not there.
It's there, but it's not there, and the demography, I think, that you talk about, and the not unusual nature of early colonial Australia. Many frontiers, in fact, most frontiers had that kind of sex ratio, but certainly, right through the 19th century, particularly in rural areas, I think it's a really important part of our history.
But there was this wonderful mythology, Frank, about the weather. That we were a hot climate, so therefore we were a bunch of randy buggers, really, those Antipodean sorts,
Yeah. Well, this idea, of course, would also occur in British history, and I'm allowed to say, of course, that
it's very wet in Britain.
It was cold. Well, and it was associated.
Takes all climates.
Yeah.
The amorous Italian, and I can say this, the idea of the kind of, the Latin climates producing.
Are you trying to say something to me, Frank?
Well, but no, that idea was taken up in the colonies, and it led to theories that our youth were particularly precocious, and that girls lost their virginity earlier in the colonies than back at home. Whether any of this is actually true, I think, is questionable. It's certainly true that young women in the colonies reached sexual maturity earlier. Menstruation occurred earlier, but probably for dietary reasons and issues to do with a relatively healthy lifestyle rather than the issue of climate.
So I'm interested in all of your thoughts, really, about this question of whether the history of sex and sexuality is really actually a history of control. Cheryl?
Really, as a feminist, the thing that I always think about is male domination and patriarchy, and how only very recently, relatively in history, and correct me if I'm wrong, have women actually had sexual autonomy. And even that, that's still a conversation that's always, men are viewed different. When men are promiscuous, we don't even have a word for a male slut. A slut is, by definition, female.
What that word would be?
I don't know what that word. We need to invent the word. And there's
by the end of tonight, we'll come up with an equivalent.
And even if that word did exist, it would mean different things to us culturally. And so, I do think that, in our lives, in your life and mine, probably, just in the course of my life, I've seen there be change when it comes to these sorts of things. My mother got married because she was pregnant, and she got pregnant because she had sex. Like many people in the 60s in America, didn't have access to birth control, And what their options were, abortion was illegal, and they became pregnant, and then, were basically forced into marriage or forced to, many of them surrender their babies for adoption. And so really the trajectory of my mother's life was defined by a sexual act. And I don't think that that's so rare when it comes to women throughout history.
No, absolutely not.
Farah?
Well, I think, the modern conception that women are much less sexual than men, which is born in the 18th century, has had a tremendous effect through the 19th and into the 20th century, and we're still living through that. And there are wonderful oral histories of, men and women happily married in the early 20th century, where looking back, they're interviewed separately, and it's quite clear that this idea of, lying back and doing your duty is absolutely mainstream sexual culture in England, anyway, for women. I mean,
this is an important
women
qualification.
Not supposed to enjoy sex, and as Cheryl says, the idea that women are equally lustful and that they have a right to behave as promiscuously as men is still something that we challenges mainstream preconceptions.
It wasn't always like that, though, was it? I mean, your book documents that there was this...
Yeah, for most of history, everyone agreed, took for granted that women were much more lustful than men, that women were the ones who led men astray, that men, were the victims of female seduction. The whole story of Eve in the Garden of Eden is, endlessly recycled. It's a classical trope, then it's a biblical trope. So for centuries, female passion is held to be much stronger than male passion. So much so that the idea that a woman should orgasm is so commonplace that people think that that's actually what makes a child be conceived. If a woman climaxes, then a child's conceived. It's a normal part of having sex. But by the end of the 18th century, people are seriously doubting whether women even orgasm, or whether normal, respectable women should climax, because it's such an unnatural idea.
It's so good that we laugh about that now.
Absolutely.
And yet you mark the 18th century as the century of the first sexual revolution.
Absolutely. It's a revolution for men, first of all. It's a revolution
for straight men.
For straight propertied men.
Funny how that works.
It's funny. But, it's a bit like democracy. I mean, we shouldn't just... throw out the baby with the bathwater. The democracy, too, is invented in the 18th century. The great political revolutions in France and in Haiti and in America established a new way of thinking about politics, and democracy is central to that. And we are the heirs of that, and we've developed that subsequently into what we have today. It's a very valuable thing. But at the beginning, it's democracy just for white, upper-class men. Women don't have the vote, slaves don't have the vote.
White and upper class, that's important, because class and race figure in a number of your stories, actually.
Absolutely. But sexual freedom is like democracy in that sense. I mean, it's a good thing, it's born there, but it's, it takes a long time to become accessible to everyone. We're still grappling with that.
Ben, interested in your thoughts on this question of control, the history of sex being a story of the history of control, and panic, and suppression, and repression, it was all about containing it.
Absolutely. I mean, when I think of that question of control, I always think of law, and I also think of culture as well. I mean, that historical context is quite interesting, and how our sexuality and how we express our sexual identity can flourish or be completely suppressed by whatever dominant attitudes there are at the time. I mean, I come from Queensland, and it was only just over 20 years ago where homosexuality was still a criminal offence. And as I was writing my book, Gaysia, I was wary in a sense of writing a book that was a direct comparison, like what sexual freedoms as an Australian do I take for granted? And let me explore these other countries and how terrible they have it. Because that's always a dangerous sort of mission to present yourself, because it's not quite, it's not quite right in a way. Going to a country like China, for instance, you land and you could say, well, they haven't had their Stonewall moment. They haven't risen up against all their suppressors, but China's a very different culture, and in their way, you could argue that homophobia as we have it doesn't exist in a country like China. But that's largely because they don't really have a broad modern-day vocabulary for what homosexuality is, especially outside of the major cities. So you could say that they've got a much different problem about invisibility and not being able to express their identity, because how do you express your sexual identity when you don't literally have the words for it?
They were finding ways. I mean, the story you tell in China is of them coupling as heterosexuals, pretend.
Absolutely.
Quite officially. So, you know, men and women marrying explicitly so that they can have relationships with same-sex partners.
I mean, it's often said that if you're a Chinese man, you will marry, and if you're a gay Chinese man, you will marry as well, but not gay marriage. You'll probably marry a woman, and that might be because you're a closeted man, or it might be because you've gone online, and this is interesting, something I didn't really know about until I went over to China, which is that a lot of people, especially young people, will go onto the internet and find the classified sections where it's, you know, more or less gay man seeks lesbian for sham marriage. Can you tick the following criteria? And in some senses, it's just for the pageantry of the wedding, I guess, for their parents, but also for the theatre. And then in other cases, it's because they want the legal paperwork done. And in other cases, they do want property and children shared between them. And they lead these incredible double lives. It's also almost the premise of a strange sitcom that I would totally watch.
But it's interesting that, you know, you are presuming, and by and large we all presume these days, that everyone has a sexual identity. Yes. And it's really the most essential thing we think about human beings, that they are either gay or straight, or maybe some are bisexual, so on. And that's a very modern idea in itself. For most of history, people didn't think that way, and very recently in the West as well, there were plenty of men who had sex with men, especially in their youth, and then would marry and have children, have a very happy family life, maybe now and again sleep with a man as well. Yeah. And for most of history, it's been the acts that people perform with their bodies that have been the things that people talk about and conceptualize, rather than this idea that you have one identity.
And indeed, the ability to dominate both particularly young men, young boys and women was, seen as a sign of virility, really, 17th century, perhaps into the 18th century. Yeah. And indeed, even in convict Australia, there's obviously, one of the things about convict Australia is that it's a bureaucracy and therefore well documented. And, we do have really good sources that talk about these almost, they're not homosexual subcultures, but certainly these kind of cultures of sex between men or between men and youths within the convict system. And
well, how do they talk about that?
Yeah.
How does it reveal itself?
And conduct records, when people get caught. And I think that's very much a part of writing sexual history. It's in those moments of disruption of the court case, or, someone being spied by an authority, being under surveillance, when we actually are able to see these things and they become evident. And that can be a danger too, because it means that it's often moments of disruption and crisis that, we see but are not typical perhaps of experience. So, with respect to same-sex behaviour between men, we only find out when people are caught, and so there can be quite, well-developed cultures of sex between men, which we simply don't see.
Yeah.
And that whole idea of sexual acts being an act rather than a sexual identity, that's not some historical relic at all. And you even hear of people like when Gore Vidal was writing about his sexuality, that he didn't really relate to this idea of any sort of gay identity, that he had sex with men. And even in a lot of sexual health literature and people who work in that field, you hear that term of MSM, which is men who have sex with men, but they don't identify as homosexual or gay or anything like that. And as you travel through Asia, as I travelled through Asia, a lot of people would say that they had sex with men and it didn't have any bearing on who they were. They were married or were about to get married and would have children and maybe stop the behaviour, would maybe continue the homosexual behaviour.
How did you respond to that as a gay man? That kind of, they were being quite arbitrary about their identity.
Well, I remember,
because we would frame that and say, well, they're just not out yet.
Well, I remember talking to one HIV worker in in Delhi, I think, and she was talking about when she first went out to do HIV prevention work out in the field, and she was an Indian woman, but she'd worked in the States for a long time during the HIV/AIDS crisis there. And there, of course, this idea of sexuality as an identity is very much ingrained in the culture at the moment. And then she came over to India and tried to do the same work and apply it into this different cultural context, and found it very, very difficult, because the men that she would meet in cruising spots would say, well, what are you doing? Like, why are you reaching out to us? Like, I'm not gay, I'm not this, and I'm a man and I fuck men, but I'm on top, so I'm not gay. So that sort of thing is quite common, especially in quite a few Asian cultures, that it depends on the act whether you are gay or not. If you're the top, you're macho, you're a man, and therefore not gay. Yes.
Cheryl, I'm interested in Cheryl just said to us that she just checked her inbox, her Dear Sugar inbox, and there were 8,000 emails there waiting for her. I don't know how you handle that.
And they're all long letters of people detailing their secrets and sorrows and problems.
It's unbelievable to me. How much of those anxieties that people have shared with you over the years is occupied in some way with sex or sexual identity?
A lot of them. I mean, as I said when we first began talking, sex is essential to who we are. And so it creeps into people's lives and their problems in all the ways that you would imagine. There's a huge category of letter writers who are happily partnered. They love the person they're with, but monogamy has proven to be difficult. That they're bored with their sex lives, or they're no longer attracted to their partner, or they are lusting after the guy who works the counter at the coffee shop. And what do? That's a huge category. The other category, it turns out...
Which makes you wonder about the very nature of monogamy and expectation of monogamy in human culture anyway, but we might get to that.
Yeah, monogamy, it turns out, is quite problematic. Oh. I think that for many of us... Is that an understatement? Yeah. I think many of us, I certainly want... What did you say?
I quite like monogamy.
Do you?
Yeah.
You have to say that.
And I do too. I have been with my partner for 18 years, and I've managed to be monogamous, but...
she says managed.
Managed, no.
Sorry.
But it's not without its challenges, and it really is contrary, sort of in many... I think all of us would say, right? It's contrary to our true nature. And many of us aspire to monogamy for reasons that don't have to do with sex, that have to do with having a life with someone and trust and, all of those things. And so that's a big problem, and I don't know the answer to it. A lot of times, too, people write to me because they don't know how to have sex. They're more 30-year-old virgins than you would imagine, or at least than I imagined. And there's this funny thing that happens. There's this time there's this, at least in the United States, I'm sure it's the same here, you're meant to kind of lose your virginity in your late teens or early 20s. And if somehow you didn't...
Well, early teens, actually, more and more in Australia.
Right, sure. Right. I would say in America, too, if you hit the age of about 20, 21, and you're still a virgin, it becomes very odd.
Yeah, what is it about that taboo? What is that?
I think it's... What is it? Does anyone have a historical, academic explanation?
Go back to Farah's point about the emergence of a modern sense of sexual identity. It's one's sexual behaviour, who one has sex with, what kind of sex one has, is so bound up in selfhood now that this actually matters in a way that it didn't matter for earlier generations.
In the 18th century, people's sex lives compared to our own were so comparatively restricted that if you went to the sexually most adventurous people in the Western world in the 18th century, namely the prostitutes of Amsterdam, and the police did this once, and I read this report. They went to them and asked them about anything really shocking that had happened recently. And two of them came forward after they needed quite a lot of help coming forward with this shocking story. And they said that a man had come to them and wanted them to have sex completely naked. And in the 18th century, this is it's not completely unheard of, but it is a really, really shocking thing to do.
They were all never nudes.
They were never nude when they had sex. And if you look at pornography, I mean, there's imaginary pornography where people are sometimes completely naked. That's kind of, clearly gods or, people in classical, of classical kind copulating naked.
And the rest are sort of spending their time in frottage or something.
Exactly, realistic pornography. They just, unbutton their breeches and pull things up and that's what they thought was
Were
normal.
they cold or why?
Yeah, they were. there's no central heating.
You know what? I don't know that that's even fully gone away. A lot of times I'm asked, what's the worst advice you've ever received? And I know for sure that when I was 14, I had a conversation with my grandmother, who's still alive. She's 91. And her advice to me was, when you get married, never, ever fully undress in front of your husband. Never let him see you entirely naked, even during sex.
Yeah.
There are stories from mid-20th century Australia of wives who'd never seen their husbands naked. So,
Well, maybe that's the secret to monogamy. It maintains the mystery. I'm going to go home and try that.
Maintaining the mystery.
So, I mean, what did that leave you feeling like?
I mean, I thought she was, insane, but it was part of too. She was raised Catholic, and was very condemning. I mean, my mother was her daughter, the 19-year-old who got pregnant out of wedlock, and it was her mother who said, "You are either going to marry this guy, or you're going to be sent away, and you're going to give me your baby, and we're going to pretend I was the one who was pregnant." And so she is. And wasn't unique for her generation. I mean, this was essentially the sexual moral code that my mother grew up in, and then many people in the culture then. And so I think that what she was trying to do too was maintain a sense of moral decency even in the sexual act, which I think is
that's very, very deep in Western culture, isn't
very
it?
Deep.
And
maybe what's happening now is we are actually throwing that off.
Yeah.
That it's not immoral to be immoral in sex, right?
Yeah. And that pleasure is itself a good thing, and sex.
I'll come to pleasure.
Okay, sorry, got to pleasure too quickly.
But I want to first talk about that virgin, the many virgins, the many 30-year-old virgins that you hear from, because in popular culture we kind of parody the 30, 40-year-old virgin.
Yeah.
So how did you tread down the line of a response to those men and women who contacted you with terrible sense of anxiety?
Yeah, I don't tend to tread very lightly. I just say, go out and get laid. Go fuck somebody. Because, the thing about not having sex, the solution is just to fuck somebody. If
you put them all in touch with one another, that would solve it.
Just lay down tops,
just
get
go
them in a
do
room.
it. I mean, it's like just popping a balloon or something. It's done, And
But you can understand I mean, really, you can understand their anxiety about what am I meant to do? They might never have kissed anyone.
Right. That's the trick for me. And we were talking backstage about
real dolls.
Real dolls. And I think maybe this has always existed, but maybe it's happening more and more. Is this really? There's so much sex available via the internet. And so a lot of these people who are virgins, they've, on the other hand, seen so many sexual images and witnessed so many things that really none of us probably ever dreamed of when we were kids. Maybe you guys did, I don't know. But
dreamed.
And so what has happened is they've had all this sex with themselves, like really X-rated sex with themselves, and not even shared a kiss with somebody in real life.
Yeah.
And that's my suspicion of what's happening.
Yeah, well, there's a whole conversation to be had about kids and porn too, and what that means for kids as they, discover their own sexuality. Just describe what real dolls are for the benefit of everyone.
The reason why we brought up real dolls before was that there have been several feature articles, and there's been a fascinating documentary about real dolls, which aren't blow-up dolls. They're actually very lifelike, and they weigh like humans. They absorb human warmth, and a lot of people buy them for companionship, actually.
Japan.
I think they might be made.
Maybe.
Yeah. There's a huge market for them from several places now, I think, and I remembered reading in a feature article, there was one guy who had a real doll and saw this real doll as his companion, and he would walk down the street and he would see couples and he would think to himself, I don't understand how that happens. And in a way, you can sort of instinctively empathise or understand that. Like, how do you make that leap between being by yourself to talking to someone else to asking them to like you, and then you liking them, and then you do this. You know, what is that?
I like the gesture.
I think that's so
it's
a mystery.
It's
a
harder than it
mystery.
looks.
and I think we're so exposed to pornography, and the pornographic storylines are very quick in
Right.
terms of the pizza boy arrives.
Bob a plumber or something,
Exactly.
don't
Call
they?
so many plumbers until it happens. But there's not much discussion about how does a relationship work that leads, you know, to a sexual relationship that you would like as well. I think that's not very discussed. I mean, I've looked at sex ed in some of my stories as well, and so much of sex ed is inadequate in so many different ways. And one of the ways in which it can be inadequate is that it talks so much about mechanics and contraception, and this goes there and then baby is formed, you know, that sort of stuff, but not about how you actually engage and those sort of trickier grey zones that are actually quite hard, and the rules aren't necessarily cemented.
This is such a crucial question, the whole sex ed question. I spoke to a whole stack of high school students recently who said exactly that. They couldn't believe how tedious and unhelpful sex ed was. It was the sort of basic mechanics of reproduction.
And unfunny and joyless as
and
well.
Totally joyless.
And no discussion of pleasure. So especially young girls as well aren't even told that they should enjoy this thing. It's how to prevent getting diseases that will rot their vaginas off, you know? And that's not, as a teenager, how you think about sex.
It's a kind of residual civics, isn't it? It's sex or responsible sexual behaviour as a kind of a precondition for responsible citizenship, and that must be deeply unattractive to your average teenager, I imagine.
As soon as you said civics, Frank, I was like, wow, I am there.
For a time in my life, I worked as a pregnancy prevention counselor in a middle school. And
that was the title.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was really these girls who were, 12 and 13 and 14, all of them in very, very difficult circumstances, living in poverty. Hardly any of them had a father on the scene. Their fathers were all in prison or drug addicts or just unknown. Their mothers, very young, in very hard lives. And so the goal, my mission was essentially, and I worked in a school, but I wasn't a school employee. And in the job interview, for me to get this job, one of the questions was, describe to us what a blowjob is. And so that tells you what they wanted me to do. They wanted me to really talk to the girls about sex. And so every week we would meet, and like I said, most of them were sexually active, many of them with much older men in their 20s and 30s, having sex with 14-year-old girls and such. And my job was just to keep them from getting pregnant and getting diseases. And so I had this box, and the rule was they could ask any question and put it in that box. And none of the questions were, how are babies conceived, or, it wasn't the civics lesson. It was, the reason I was asked to describe a blowjob in my job interview is I had to describe that with a straight face over and over again to girls. And things, unbelievable questions, real questions about their bodies, about orgasm, about boys' bodies, and really it was real sex education. Is sex supposed to hurt? Is it okay if we do it this way? All of those things. Many of the questions were very disturbing and kind of heartbreaking. But I think
because it was an indicator of what sorts of experiences that they'd had.
It was, and I think too that it's an indicator of what we all want to know. To be honest with you, when I was 15, I thought a blowjob was just actually blowing on the penis. I needed someone to explain that to me, right? And so who was there to explain that, And so the question is, why don't we just do that? And we all know that, right? We all know that there are all these mysterious aspects of our own sexuality, really, at that age. So,
Farah, I want to think about then how people got to know about sex when this revolution happened. How did they start talking about it publicly? I mean, certainly there was the role of the sexual celebrity and the role of the novel.
Well, and that is all part of this much bigger thing, which is the huge media revolution of the 18th century. The 18th century, the moment at which mass media come into being. And that means that for the first time, newspapers and magazines and journals and all these new outlets are created that allow people to communicate with strangers. And one of the earliest things that happens is that someone has the bright idea of having a newspaper where people can write in with their questions. And there are so many questions straight off about love and courtship and sex that this spins off into a separate newspaper quite quickly. And people are asking not quite as explicit questions. Blowjobs very rare in the 18th century. But
well, the
questions were... What's the first blowjob?
Yeah, that's, I'm still working on that. And,
in Australia, my first blowjob.
But questions about... We'll get back to you.
Yeah.
Is masturbation harmful? Can a man and a woman just be friends? There are questions.
We're still wondering that.
We're still wondering. That's a really good question. The media are tremendously important in allowing, people to exchange sexual knowledge and communicate their fears and have them answered and echoed and read about other people's experiences. The novel is so fantastic because it's the first form that allows people really in detail to get inside the head of a fictional character and understand their emotions and see what they're thinking. The stage drama, which until then had been the main form, doesn't really let you do that. People just have to speak out what they're feeling. But novels, for the first time, allowed people to get inside the minds of people in love. That's why they're such a perennial...
What about the history of pornographic images? I mean, when did they... Well, they've probably been with us for as long as humanity, hey?
Yes. But again, in the 18th century, there's the first moment at which cheap, mass-produced images become possible. And so pornography as well becomes cheap and accessible. Before that, it's a lot of manuscripts and a lot of stuff in Latin and French that circulates amongst elite men. But from the 18th century onwards, school girls can buy pornography by the late 18th century, and they do because, again, people are prosecuted for this, and there are law cases.
What about, not just images, but writing? I remember I own this book. It's called The Pearl, and it's a collection of this pornographic. Do you know about
19th
this?
19th century, yes. Yeah.
It was published in the 1860s. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just all of these unbelievably pornographic stories.
Yes.
And is that real? Did that really exist?
Yes. It starts in the 18th century. It develops tremendously in the 19th century. The 19th century is a period of expanding sexual freedom, again, for upper-class men who try very strictly to demarcate, that sexual freedom is not for the lower classes, it's not for women, it's not for homosexuals. But meanwhile, the pornographic industry of the Victorian age explodes, and like you say, you can find almost anything written about by the 19th century.
What about Australia in the Victorian era? Because you write really provocatively about those sexual engineers. There was a lot of panic in Australia at that time about contraceptives, about sex ed, the whole bit. The sexual engineers really didn't want people having sex that was outside of marriage. Or tell us about that kind of the kind of paranoia that occupied Australia for, it seems, a lot longer actually than the story Farah tells.
Yeah, I think if you're looking for, again, something distinctive about Australia, or at least perhaps distinctive about settler societies like Australia, it's a sense that you have to really build and create a population. And I think that it meant that the relationship between sex and reproduction, has, again, a particular shape in a context such as Australia. And so, for example, you have this famous investigation or inquiry into the decline of the birth rate in New South Wales in 1903-4, in which basically a government inquiry is set up, and pharmacists and doctors and priests, but never ordinary folk, and certainly not women, are asked to give their testimony about why this is happening. And it's a wonderful source for finding out about the kinds of contraception that people are using.
What were people using?
They were using condoms and they were using diaphragms, and but perhaps most of all, they were using withdrawal, coitus interruptus, and probably also simply being moderate. And I think Farah talks about this in his book too. Periodic abstinence is a term that demographers have used. And, there's a real, a kind of almost a culture of abstinence that emerges in the 19th century particularly. And there's no doubt that is one of the contributors to a declining birth rate. But as you say, this does lead to moral panic in a society that feels, it's got a small white population in the Asia Pacific area. It feels besieged by potential enemies, whether it's China or Japan. And so I think when the modern sexual revolution happens in Australia in the 1960s and 70s, it's that separation of sex for pleasure from sex for reproduction, which we find everywhere, of course. I mean, there's nothing distinctive. But in the Australian case, I think that given that long history of fear about basically race suicide, as they called it, declining birth rates, it has a really interesting shape. I think. That
was one story, but parallel to that was probably a terror that sex could equal pleasure. So let's talk about that relationship now. How do we... sex is everywhere. It's legs is wide open, looking at us on every billboard and small screen. Everywhere we look, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. I wonder whether, though, we are any more comfortable with it, by virtue of the fact that it's everywhere, or whether we still have all the same anxieties and shames and embarrassment and phobias and the like. I mean, are we any more open about sex and pleasure?
I think we really are, absolutely.
Yeah.
Would we, just a conversation like this that we're having. And I can tell you one of the things I've thought about a number of times just listening to the discussion tonight about sexual identity and that being, straight or gay and that being a new thing. But what I see as sugar, right in the sugar column is not even just that anymore. People are writing to me about, what I guess we would think of as their fetishes. And really what I've even come to think is we all have a fetish. Right? It's just like if your fetish just happens to be vanilla straight sex, that's your fetish. If your fetish happens to be, being chained up and beaten, that's your fetish. And so many people who write to me about sexual anxiety, like I said, some of it's the run-of-the-mill, how do I stay monogamous or how do I lose my virginity? But a lot of it is really people very much owning their desire, and their desire being what until very recently would be considered too shameful to even admit to. And through the internet, you can go out there and find the people who love, what are they called?
Real dolls.
Real dolls. There's a whole tribe of them out there, and they're talking to each other on the internet. And the people who want to make love with the banana, there's a whole thing out there for them. I'm quite sure. I've never, but any of these, we can find each other now. If you want to make love to a banana, there is support for you. And so I do think that is something that is a combination of the internet age, feminism, an increased sense of openness. You disagree with me?
No, I do agree. I think every generation congratulates itself, or at least every generation that I'm familiar with in the last, sort of 150 years, on how much more open they are about sex, how much more rational. Sorry,
you're younger than you look.
How much more rational they are about sex. But there is a truth in this. Benjamin would have been arrested by now as late as the 1980s because he said fuck before.
I still should be.
You probably should, maybe should.
And I said fuck. I'm
you
a
said
woman.
Fuck too,
I would have been hung. Yeah.
We'd basically be down to Farah and me, and in fact, I would have just been hauled off as well.
In some parts of the world, yeah, that's right.
John Wilkes said in the 18th century, life can little more supply than just a few good fucks. And then we die. Now you're on your own, Frank.
It's all of us now.
My entire panel has been arrested at this point.
But so you do believe or you don't believe that we're right in congratulating ourselves for progress?
No, I think we are. I don't think it's been a straight line, and I think that certain taboos are reinvented or recast. I mean, the whole issue of young people and sex is a good example, I think. And the figure of the pedophile emerged as a type, a source of moral panic, if you like, from probably about the 1980s, often constructed in the West as a predatory male homosexual. That was the particular construction of the pedophile. Now, that wouldn't have been predictable as late as probably the 1970s, when there was all this discourse of liberation about. But it wasn't as straightforward as that. Boundaries were drawn and redrawn. You had people arguing in the 70s that, an anti-censorship case that said people should be able to read or see whatever they like. It's up to the individual. It's a sphere of privacy. The state shouldn't have a role in this. But then people began to reconsider. And then, does this include child pornography? Well, it was decided in the Australian case from about 1976, 77, no, it doesn't. There is something that we're not going to allow. So I don't think it's a straight line. I think it's probably a jagged line, and there's lots of,
one thing is people are clearly having more sex nowadays than they probably ever had in the past.
Having more sex,
but are they having more good sex? I mean, good sex is the holy grail, and I'm not entirely clear about that. I mean, clearly, I agree with Cheryl. Everyone is more open. People own their fetishes more openly. I think another thing that's happening is that people are much more comfortable owning their own bodies, and that's not just about sex. It's about tattoos. It's about dress. It's about feeling that this is yours to do with as you wish. But
we're told we're having good sex. If you watch any of the films and television shows, there's a kind of model, a screen model for what good sex looks like, and that places an awful lot of expectations on us.
Part of my point is that good sex surely has to do not just with physical action, but with, how that connects to the relationship more generally that you have with the person or the people that you're having sex with. And so if
that's your definition of good sex?
Well, I think that's one thing that good sex probably ought to be is we can't. I don't think it could be the case that we lived in a world in which sex was entirely divorced all the time from relationships. And I think that a lot of the new sex, additional sex that we're having at the moment, seems to be just sex for the sake of sexual pleasure. And I wonder if that's adding to the sum of human happiness or not, or is neutral or what.
Ben, your travels, I think, for Gaysia really revealed how messy it all is still for many people. And I was really struck by your encounters with the Real Love Ministry in Malaysia. Tell us about that, because there you had a kind of community that had come together to be religious together in a struggle, a sexuality struggle.
I mean, each of the countries I wrote about, I chose a particular topic to focus on. So none of the topics were exclusive to that country in a way. I could have easily written about ex-gay conversion therapies in India, which I actually did touch on. There's a yoga guru there called Swamiji Baba Ramdev who says that through yoga you can cure yourself of homosexuality and through correct breathing techniques. So if any of you have asthma or tight hamstrings, you might want to get that checked out.
Well, you had an encounter with him, which was, he didn't like you really by the end of it.
No, not at all. And at the same time, it's not just something that happens over there either. I've written stories in Australia about these ministries that aren't as strong or aren't as prolific as they are in, I guess, what you'd call emerging markets in Asia, which is quite ripe for this sort of stuff. I mean, in Malaysia, I talked to 3 different organisations, 2 Christian and 1 Islamic, that had started up in various times and had different numbers of congregation members. But the Real Love Ministry was headed by a man called Pastor Edmund Smith, who was a Christian minister. Pastor Edmund had made headlines across Malaysia in Malaysian Women's Weekly, the story of his conversion from homosexuality to family man. He spent most of his youth in all-boys schools, being what I guess you'd call a prolific homosexual in so many ways, and then found, he got to a certain point where he didn't want to be leading this life anymore. And he went through a conversion therapy in Singapore, through the power of Christ, was healed of homosexuality, married her, and started this Christian ministry, which has a lot of Facebook pages where he lists his interests, such as Desperate Housewives and Glee. And and what there's that comic introduction to this whole scenario, and it's ridiculous. And the first day I walk into real life ministries, everyone's singing, and Pastor Edmund is turning to people and making, beautifully elderly women turn to each other and talk about how they're sexual beings, and they're like, "You are a sexual being." It's very, very strange. And children are there in the front row as well. And then on Thursday nights, they've got a program where it's about really working on fixing your sexual brokenness. And that's when I encountered a lot of people, many of whom were my age, late 20s, early 30s, who had struggled, in quote marks, with same-sex attraction all their lives, and were now at a point where they wanted to fix themselves through God. And the struggle for me interviewing these people was that, I'm gay myself, and I'm similar age to them. I'm Asian, so I sort of look like them as well. So I felt real empathy with who they were. And the struggle I had in talking to them was that a lot of them had been through hideous experiences. Some of them had been arrested. A lot of them had been put into psychiatric wards, heavily overly medicated, gone through electroshock therapy, gone through violent abuse from parents or family members or partners.
And that's a compulsion, isn't it, then, to want to try and do something about it, given that they've been so ostracised.
And they would say to me, "I'm in a much better place now." And the difficult thing for me to comprehend is, well, am I in a position to argue with you? If you feel that way, I would like to reach over the table and grab you in a completely unprofessional sense and say, "This is my life, and it doesn't have to be the way your life is." But who's to say in that cultural context whether there's any truth in that claim at all?
Yeah.
Be right at home in pre-18th century Western society, in the Middle Ages, the 16th and 17th century, because the aim of punishing people for their sexual acts was always not just to deter others, but to make them see the error of their ways, and to get them exactly to that kind of contrition, and to see that actually their punishment was a kind of charity. It was a means to get them to rejoin the straight and narrow. And thousands and thousands of people did believe that. So I think, on the one hand, their minds do work like that in the past and in the present, but on the other hand, you can say that's not quite right. That's not, from our perspective, really how we should be treating people.
Is the source of all that, historical shame and guilt around sexuality and sexual expression? I mean, I guess there are two prongs to this, isn't there? It could be that it's also where we reveal most about ourselves and we expose ourselves. So there's that kind of element. But also, is religion the fundamental thread through this story of repression?
It's one of the threads, I think. And, all the great monotheistic religions seem to have these hang-ups, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. And the great early Christian thinker who was most influential in this was St. Augustine, who's a very interesting guy, because for the early part of his life, he, has a child out of wedlock, lives with his mistress. He's just a young, hip academic, and then he sees, the error of his ways, and he spends most of his adult life, in the desert, praying, abstaining, writing to other bishops about, how bad sex is and everyone should. But his obsession with it partly derives from the fact that he feels he can never quite control it. And there's a wonderful letter right when he's in his late 70s or 80s where he complains to another bishop that so strong is human passion that he has spent decades and decades and decades subduing it completely. He hasn't had sex for 60 years, and yet his genitals stir now and again against his own will. And this idea that, you can't even control your own body, that powerful is this, is part of the idea that this is part of the essential sinfulness of human beings. This is part of God's curse upon them. And that's why it needs to be restrained so much.
Cheryl, has that revealed itself in many of the letters that you've received? I mean,
The stirring of genitals?
yes, that, and
Any
the kind of and the heritage of the impact of religion.
Not so commonly. I mean, I do think that there are times that people express shame about their desires. But, I have to say, and part of it is that the sugar column, I do think it attracts people who already have a fairly open-minded view of sex and sexuality. So I'm more commonly, when I get letters from gays and lesbians, it's not, I'm so ashamed, it's, my parents are going to throw me out of the house if I come out to them, what should I do? And so things along that line. It's dealing with other people's condemnation and shame. And there are some cases where somebody will have a desire, a fantasy that confuses them or makes them feel ashamed. But usually that's not so much rooted in religion as it is just their own sense of what's too weird for them to actually act out. What does this mean? There's one letter, a young woman wrote to me, and she said, look, I'm heterosexual, but every time, basically what I'm obsessed with in my sexual fantasies is I fantasize about dominating grotesquely overweight, grotesquely obese women. What does this mean, and how can I stop fantasizing about this?
How do you answer a question like that?
You can Google it and find it online. My answer, essentially, I think what I tell people over and over again is sugar is, that it's okay to be who you are. Like it's, as long as you're not hurting other people in the course of fulfilling your desires, whether, in whatever aspect of your life, including sexual, that, as long as you're not abusing others or harming others or being deceitful to others, that you can really own that. And it's okay to sit at home and fantasize about things that you find to be weird or uncomfortable. I mean, I think most of us do. I mean, if you look at the top fantasies, the top sexual fantasies that both men and women have, straight and gay, they're almost all things that make us feel rather uncomfortable socially. Things like rape fantasies, or those sorts of things that many of us would never really actually want to do in real life. And so I try to tell people it's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay. And I also, in each case, I also really push people to maybe go deeper, because sometimes the fantasies we have or the sexual concerns we have, they're really linked to other parts of our lives. Sometimes that's past sexual abuse or childhood issues with parents that have yet to be resolved. And they really transcend the sexual realm, but seep into it. I do think that our sexual identities are in part formed by, certainly people who've had early childhood sexual trauma. That does manifest itself in their sex lives sometimes, and that can be problematic until they address it.
Yes, indeed. Hey, let's come to some questions, shall we? We've got the time. We're going to pop the lights up, I hope, and we've got 4 microphones, and if you could just duck up and cue at a mic and let it rip, I'll just come to you. I'll name the number of the microphone and we'll go for it. Go for it. Thanks. It is. There you are.
Hi. Clio magazine went through a relaunch where they took sex completely off the cover because they believe young people are less promiscuous and more conservative than we used to be. I really should know your thoughts on that. Like, is Gen Y a little bit more careful because we've been warned for so long that sex is bad?
Well, I'm Gen Y, and technically I'm on the older end of that spectrum, and I don't know, a lot of my friends still like a lot of sex. It's interesting whether there is a shift in culture. I'm not sure whether they're identifying something or maybe manufacturing it as well. I think a lot of magazines are still focused on sex, and there's still a huge appetite for it. I think there's still a huge appetite for education. I think back on when I was growing up, and the places we would look for information were places like Dolly Doctor, for instance, which was just discharge city. Every second question was about discharge, and we're like, wow, look at my sisters and say, you guys are going to get a lot of discharge. And so I think there's probably still an appetite for it, but I wonder if that appetite and questioning of it has moved in different spaces, especially with the internet as well. And that's probably almost a safer space to ask those questions in forums, in Q&A. I'm thinking of what you do online. I'm thinking of the men who run iBuy, which is a queer website based in the US, but is hugely popular in China because it's in Chinese language, and it's pretty much the only website that will allow users to submit their own questions about sexuality. And it's far more safe than having it printed in a public column in a magazine. So I'm just speculating here, but I wonder whether that yearning is still there, but just placed in different places now.
Interesting. Any other thoughts there?
Well, I think also there's a sense in the 1970s when Clio was founded, to stick Jack Thompson in the centrefold was a radical thing to do. It was transgressive, and particularly given what we've been talking about with respect to female sexuality. It's explicit recognition of female sexual desire in that sort of way. But, 30, whatever it is, 40 years onwards, it's no longer transgressive, perhaps in the same way. Perhaps in some ways sex is being, I wouldn't say marginalised, but its relationship to identity is perhaps becoming a little bit more indirect than it has been in the past. Queer is often defined in those sort of terms, isn't it? That it's queer is about performance. It's less about specifically, sexuality as such. So maybe it's something along those lines.
Watch that microphone. It's just rubbing against your.
Sure.
Just speaking of, we're not going to go there. Just move it away from your face a bit. Thank you.
Firstly, Natasha, you're the person. Why I'm late to work every day, because I listen to your program from 9 to 9:30, but that's beside the point. I had a question with a broader historical context. I recently read Christopher Hitchens' autobiography, Hitch 22, and he talked about Greco-Roman attitudes towards sex as opposed to Judeo-Christian. I guess this is for Farah as much as anyone else. Could you give us some insight or unpack the Greco-Roman attitudes towards sex? Because Hitchens pointed at them being more liberal, less hung up with guilt, shame, all of these things we evoked earlier, and that a revolution may have occurred really in the context of Judeo-Christian society, and that in that Greco-Roman society there was already much more permissive attitudes towards sex, and it was not shamed or cloaked in this guilt that we were referring to.
I think there's some truth in that. It is more liberal in various important ways than Judeo-Christian society, not least in the tolerance of same-sex relations between men. But on the other hand, those are very clearly limited in various ways to particular kinds of relationship between a powerful man and a younger boy, and the power relations there are quite defined. And the bigger point is that in Greco-Roman society, as in Judeo-Christian society, everyone agrees that ultimately lust is a dangerous passion. Lust is something that is in all human beings, but should be controlled, needs to be dealt with very carefully. The Greeks and the Romans allowed slightly greater latitude, but even they would not allow sexual freedom in the way that we think of it. What we have nowadays is completely different. We have an acceptance that individuals should decide for themselves what they do with their own bodies, that it's not the community's business, and that's the essential difference.
Okay, doke. Let's have another one. Number 4, I think. Yeah.
Whoa, that's really loud. I'm interested in your thoughts about the influence that pornography is having on the corporal dimension of sex. I read an article recently about a woman that was concerned with a common young female propensity to remove pubic hair and to, I guess, take these images of sex that we're fed in pornography as kind of women that don't have pubic hair and they're very clean in that sense, taking that very clinical view or two-dimensional view, and it actually coming into the bedroom and young women feeling like they need to be pubic hairless and actually take away that, I guess, that smelly, dirty corporal side of the reality of our genitals. I'm interested in your thoughts on what's happening to the corporal dimension of sex, because we're experiencing it so two-dimensionally through images all of the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Total sense.
It's
yeah.
something I've thought and written a lot about. I know you all refer to the bush here as the wilderness, right? The woods. But the bush in the U.S. means something else, and I am I'm going to lead the movement of bringing the bush back, and.
We want to vote.
As long as it's not George Bush.
Exactly, not George Bush. The more fragrant bush. But, I think it's a travesty. I think it's an absolute travesty what's been done to the female body, and that women, go along with themselves, removing body hair. It used to be uncommon that you would see somebody with, altered bodies in terms of getting a boob job or taking all the hair off and all of that. And I do really think it's a demented view of the female body, and I think it's not good for women. And part of that is, I think, to be blamed on pornography. That with the internet, so many people, their first experience of the female body is those images that are unrealistic and impossible.
Can I ask why the images in the first place? Why have those particular images become popular in pornography? I don't get.
You're the historian. See, yeah, I don't know. It's
too recent for me.
It's a question I have. Does anyone know the answer?
A few people have written about this, and apparently the popularity of especially female pubic waxing became huge because in pornography it's really important to see extreme close-up penetration, and that becomes obscured when you've got pubic hair. So it's easier to trim it, and then it becomes even easier just to wax it off completely. And this isn't something that's exclusive to heterosexual pornography either. It's definitely there in gay pornography as well. I had to do a story about male genital waxing. I had to write a first-person account of it, and because as I was talking to the waxer, as interesting things were happening to me and my body, I was asking him questions about, well, how much work do you get? Who comes to you? And because male waxing and female waxing is such a huge thing across all pornography nowadays, you get men waxing all of their hair from the waist down as well, because you increasingly see less male pubic hair too. And so much of it is informed by what needs to be seen in pornography, which is the insertion and the penetration, and it's like an abattoir.
Do you think it's just about porn, though? I think it's also about that kind of assumption that to be sexual is to be young. And so we all have to, particularly for women, there's that notion that you have to be somehow prepubescent to be attractive. Well, not that young, but there is that sense. That
right. Well, it's certainly
strip it back.
It's a disturbing image to me.
Very,
for that
for
reason.
Me. Yeah, totally.
But I think the pornification of our culture is absolutely. This used to exist in one realm, and it's actually crept into our own lives, into our own bedrooms, and onto our own bodies. And the only way to resist it is bring the bush back.
But I'll just pick up on that, because at one point I read in one of your advice columns you acknowledged that paradox that women feel that they've got to look a particular way and perform like a porn star, but in fact, in the heterosexual case, their male partners are much less interested in that, perhaps. They're happy to see the body as it is in reality, not as it is on the screen.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think that in so many ways women are overly anxious about what their male potential lovers will think of their bodies. Pretty much, men throughout time have wanted to have sex with women, and they had all kinds of different, different body shapes and sizes and shavings and not shavings. And I think that there is, through pornography, has become this, really narrow ideal that many women attach themselves to. They think, well, men won't desire me if I don't look like that. But really, in anecdotal, none of my friends have ever had much trouble getting laid, and I think that's, there's a real variety of women that are attractive to men and vice versa.
Another question, number 1.
Hi, my question is specifically for Ben, but I'd very much like to hear from other members of the panel. We've talked a lot tonight about social acceptance of sexuality and how people feel comfortable within a certain societal context. I'm interested about how societal context takes over from natural sexual urges, and if I can illustrate that in one very isolated example. In Ben's book, he talks a lot about Thai ladyboys and the ladyboy pageant. After reading that, I couldn't help thinking how many Thai ladyboys are living in a closet throughout the rest of the world. In this particular story, there's boys as young as 12 who have said, "Oh, I'm so glad I'm this age now because I can suddenly start taking hormones." It's so rife within this particular societal context that even though they are still facing struggles, it's accepted to a certain extent. So is that natural, or is it a societal context that people are aiming for, and how rife is that throughout the world?
It's a good question, and it's a question that brings up fraught issues in a way, because what we're dealing with are notions of childhood and gender and sex identity, and we don't feel comfortable with that. I've written before in the Australian context about young people who are early teens and pre-teens, and these are young Australian people who do not feel like they are the gender and the sex into which they've been born. And in order to get puberty blockers, in order to get hormones that will help you develop into the sex you feel you are, that can be a really complicated process. And why it's complicated is you have to go through several court mechanisms in order to ensure that you're sure, basically. And the reason why it becomes complicated beyond that is that if you don't do certain things within a certain period of time medically, then you start, if you were born a boy, you'll start growing an Adam's apple, and it's very hard to reverse. Your voice will change, your shoulders will broaden. Once you start developing facial hair, for instance, that's something that's very hard to start taking back. So there's a timing issue there as well. So there's this constant anxiety about whether you're doing stuff in time and whether you're actually harming the child in some way, and whether harming the child might be because you're giving them hormones and puberty suppressants, or because you're denying them that. In Thailand, what I found really fascinating, as you say, is that there were all these young people who, and reports have been done about this in other books as well, how young people will trade puberty blockers and hormones in the schoolyard, like Pokemon or baseball cards in some ways. It's not technically legal for them to do so, but it's far more available, and there's a bigger vocabulary for what they feel and different gender identities as well. And when I spoke to surgeons in Thailand, one of my main questions is it just my imagination? Because Thai ladyboys are so much more visible when you go to, especially the cities of Thailand. Am I seeing more transgender and transsexual women in this society? Are there more per capita? Can you gauge such a thing? And if so, why? And a lot of them came back with the same thing. And I'm not sure if they're right. I don't know if there's a way to gauge this, but they said, we get the feeling that there's probably just as many people who are transsexual around the world. We are a Buddhist society. We have more of a live and let live attitude. We probably just give people more permission to do such a thing. Now, that can be contested, but that's certainly how they saw it.
Okay, look, thank you for that, and thank you for your question. Number 3, hi.
Good evening. My question goes to, I suppose, identity and something that, and particularly bisexuality, and I suppose that's come through what you've been talking about this evening, but not specifically. And I'm constantly aware that you're using the terms of straight and gay, and I think the word bisexual has come out like twice. Do you really feel that there is that divide, or are we on more of a continuum? And particularly interested in the effect of labelling. I often feel that there's a bit of a pressure to quickly label yourself. Are you straight? Are you gay? And if you're bi, are you just bi because you really haven't made up your mind yet? I'm just interested in your views on that.
Great question. Go for it, folks.
I think
Look, when it comes to the acronym for queer identities, it's now LGBTIQ, LGBTIQ, and it's trying to be as inclusive as possible. And I think within that spectrum...
Try saying that on radio, it's impossible.
Exactly. But within that spectrum as well, of course, that's a minority label, but there are minorities within those minorities as well, and those minorities actively discriminate against each other as well. And certainly bisexuality is something that's often overlooked as an afterthought. And I also have to remind ourselves that all these notions of lesbian and gay, transgender, transsexual, all that stuff are constructs in some way. When I went to Myanmar/Burma, what I found were three very distinct gay categories, and gay in that Western use of the word is very specific. It's about effeminate presenting men who we would probably identify in this culture as being transgender, and they call it upwint. But then there were a bone as well, which means hider, which means that you're essentially a closeted gay man. But that came with its own sexual, your own positioning within a sexual act as well. And then tange men was something different. Lots of categories, and not necessarily ones that have equivalents within what we call LGBTIQ.
Yeah.
I think there is a stigma, isn't there? Almost a stigma of inconstancy, as if a bisexual person is someone who betrays other people. Whereas contrast that with the very early gay theorising in the 1970s. Think of someone like Dennis Altman, basically arguing that the natural state of all of us is bisexual, and the problem with patriarchal capitalist society is that it socialises us into all these sex roles that make us one thing or the other. And in this utopian society of the future, when we're all sexually free, we'll all be bisexual. And I think that was really central to a lot of gay theorising in the 70s, and in a sense was lost when gay and lesbian, and indeed the various other identities and orientations became like minorities, almost akin to ethnic minorities claiming rights, and that's very different to the gay theorising of, say, the early 1970s.
And I was just going to add is I think there's a big difference between identity and experience. I can tell you, many of the people who write me letters, they don't necessarily identify as bi, but many of them have had sexual experiences across the continuum with both men and women.
Yeah. I'm going to take two questions at once. So stay put number 4 and 3, and I'll just get your questions in a row and we'll mix them up in a jumble. Is that all right? So number 4, thank you.
My question was coming off the back of a previous question pertaining to the removal of pubic hair that someone was previously talking about. And I feel like tonight in the discussion there has been one chain of discussion which was following as we become more freedom in our speech, our actions are becoming more sexually liberated. And so therefore, taking the title of tonight, We Are Changing Sex. However, then when we started talking about the shaping of our bodies and doing an act like removing your pubic hair, that became, the discourse of tonight became, our behaviour is becoming more and more pornographic. So in that case, it would be arguing sex is changing us with the emergence of pornography. And I was wondering if the historians and in fact everyone could clarify, is this a chicken and egg situation, or is there a difference between a sexual act and how you shape your body? I would say that if one decided to remove their pubic hair, that would be a sexual act. Please.
Man, she actually wants us to answer the question for tonight's event. Can you hold your thoughts on that, and I'll just grab your question quickly. Thanks.
Do you find that in the internet age where we have the ability to connect with so many people so quickly, and apps such as Grindr has made it harder to be monogamous and be in that relationship because you have that ability to easily escape from, say, a relationship in your mind easier than dealing with the situation at heart and how you feel about it?
Great question. And just to explain for those who don't know what Grindr is, it's a phone app. It's essentially like you can hook up with people. It's like It's like a digital beat. And and you've got GPS, so you know you can just hook up with whoever you want in your area, basically, instead of going to the local dunnies, so to speak. Toilets. Just doing quick translation. If that's your cup of tea. Go for it. First question, second, whichever way.
It was a very good question, the first one. I'm not sure I can remember all of it. But... I mean, it did remind me that our talking about earlier about, people shaving their bodies was essentially negative. That this is somehow women, especially, feeling pressure to conform to a particular bad stereotype. And I think we can all agree it's not good for women to have to be pressured or feel pressured into conforming to any stereotype. But the flip side of it, and I think that is another reason why it's becoming so prevalent, possibly, is that point about people nowadays in general feeling like their bodies are more their own to do with what they like. And I think it's not a coincidence that people now are also much more tattooed than they were 10 years ago, and pierced, and in all sorts of ways feeling like, they can do what they like. And if it's empowering, far be it from me to, tell anyone what to do, but if it's empowering for a woman to shave her legs or shave her armpits or shave any bit of her body, surely that's a good thing. And I think that would be an expression, a continuation, a development of the sexual freedom that our culture has been pursuing for quite some time now.
My attitude's I'm teaching a course on this at the moment, and some of the female students in my tutorial talked about the slut walk movement, which is, and it was a really animated discussion, and there was real disagreement between them about, whether a young woman who went out at night into a dangerous area, in a skimpy costume, so these are young women making these arguments, what was that, looking for trouble, or on the other hand, should a woman be able to do that? Should they be able to fashion themselves in that sort of way and not invite that sort of problem or that sort of attention? And it's just interesting listening to 18, 19, 20-year-old women arguing this kind of thing. And there was no agreement about it. They were really quite poles apart in trying to untangle that issue.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, and it's certainly something I've struggled with in my own life as a woman and a feminist, and in answering questions as dear Sugar. And it is where does that one territory give way to the other? Where is it that you are getting a breast enhancement and shaving all your pubic hair because that's what makes you feel better about your body and own your body and your sexuality? And where are you doing that to please, or at least to imagine that you're pleasing the male gaze or the culture and the times that we live in? And it's really complicated. I think it's complicated. It's complicated for me too. Why am I wearing lipstick right now? Is it for me or is it for you? And I don't know the answer to that question, really. And I think in some ways, time will tell. One of the things that I always ask, it's kind of a litmus test, is okay, how many young women are doing that thing? Are all the young women who are removing all their pubic hair doing it because it's empowering, or because that they feel that otherwise they will be seen as unattractive? And I do think that the answer is that they believe they'll be seen as unattractive. I don't think it means they're owning their bodies, sadly. And so, and yet I think what you raise a great point, because after all, aren't we fighting for everyone to have agency over their own bodies? Yeah.
And the question of monogamy, just briefly.
Well, as I was thinking
I didn't really represent Grindr properly, actually. It's a dating app.
No, it's pretty much a GPS meets a beat. It's great.
Okay, all right. I did then.
And I was having this conversation with friends recently because I've just moved to Sydney, and a lot of young gay men tell me, rather than it being about Grindr or technology, sometimes it's about the city itself and its density of population. And because there's just so many attractive young men in Sydney, it's hard to remain monogamous because there's a culture of always looking for the next best thing. So they meet people and then they realise that they're sort of being vetted for whether they're okay or not. So sometimes I wonder if it's a city culture. Part of me also wonders whether you go onto Grindr looking for monogamy as well. Certainly there is that app in and of itself, but there are also websites that are incredibly cannily marketed towards specific goals. And this isn't just within the gay dating and hookup world as well, but also within the straight one. But, you know, there are ones that are more for certain types. Like when I log onto Facebook on my iPhone, I see there's always an ad for the same app, and it's called Castro. And it's like Grindr, but more friendly. So obviously there's more a social vibe, and there are websites that are more catered towards relationships as well. So I think there's a whole ecosystem of apps there for exactly what you're looking for.
There's that app where you can have a really long, tedious conversation about how to keep your relationship hot.
Oh, really?
It's called
that
Marriage.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, I'm just kidding.
On that note, yes, we all need that app, hey? Let's thank our wonderful, wonderful guests, Cheryl, Frank, Faramerz and Benjamin. And thank you